Wonderful. Yeah. Good morning. Great to see you. Happy Monday. I'm excited to welcome a very eminent special speaker today from the World Bank, very pertinent to the goal of this Resilience Reimagined series of addressing resilience aspects and thinking on and about and beyond national models of resilience. So this is a great opportunity. And also, in case you weren't aware, this is from the US perspective. This is National Resilience Month. August is National Resilience Month in the United States, so also very important. But it is important to understand and appreciate that resilience is a global issue, and the US is demonstrating that with the focus on resilience and climate change, among other things. But today, we are really looking at it from the global level of the World Bank. So I am excited. In case you were in any doubt, I'm Alexander Siedschlag. I'm the Dean of the Embry-Riddle Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences, the host of the series, and I am excited to have you. Since we are looking at this topic from a global perspective, and in particular today with Mary Boyer from the World Bank, let's take a moment and look at how the United Nations define resilience. And the United Nations Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction defines resilience as the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, and to recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions. Now, the World Bank is its own institution, but I have read that its funding policy, or and how it supports, other countries through financial mechanisms, that is, among other things, informed by the United Nations Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction. So that seems to be a very good segue into today's presentation. Now, Mary Boyer is a disaster risk management specialist at the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, or GFDRR. And welcome, Mary. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. You started working with the bank as a consultant in 2015 and then moved on inside the World Bank. That is great. So thank you for making time. And one of your work focuses includes, or has included, the implementation of disaster vulnerability reduction projects, as well as disaster risk financing technical assistance, or can try it again. It's still Monday morning here at headquarters. Disaster risk financing technical assistance for Caribbean countries. Mary has a BA in anthropology and peace studies from the University of Notre Dame and a master's in international economics from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Now, this ties in very well, if not excellently, into what we do here at the Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences, including but not limited with our online Master of Science in Human Security and Resilience. Mary has graciously agreed to take questions along the way as they emerge. So if you just want to leave them in the chat, that would be great. And also, as a matter of courtesy, as you are leaving your question in the chat, could you preface it with a brief introduction of yourself? And we'll still leave a few minutes open at the end, as per usual, for a comprehensive Q&A. But like I said, Mary would like to make this interactive and pick questions up or comments up as she moves along. With that, Mary, thank you so much for speaking to us today, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I always enjoy speaking in front of new audiences and also learning about the work that you're doing. So I would really appreciate if this could be interactive, also to help guide me in case I'm saying things that you already know or you already focus on. I'd like to make this as helpful as possible. So before I get started, I'd like to take the temperature of the room. How many of you are familiar with the World Bank, have interacted with the World Bank, or know about how the World Bank operates? Maybe you could give me a reaction, thumbs up, or I don't know how Zoom works. React with a thumbs up. Okay. We have a couple. Okay. Well, in that case, I will get started with a brief overview of what the World Bank does, or how we operate with client countries. I really, as the dean mentioned, I'm a disaster risk management specialist, or DRM specialist at the World Bank. And I lead the global program for emergency preparedness and response at the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. And I also lead the global program for disaster risk financing. And so what I'll be sharing with you today is really a perspective of reducing resilience, or increasing resilience, reducing vulnerability from a physical and a fiscal perspective. We are a bank after all, and so a lot of what we deal with is fiscal matters. And we find a lot of success working directly with ministers of finance, who are really in charge of decision-making for a country's financing, and making resilience an attractive matter financially. Okay, so starting off with a brief introduction of how the World Bank operates. So we have 3 ways that we interact with countries. And our primary, I'm going to refer to our countries as clients, as a bank might refer to people as their clients or businesses, in case you hear me say that. So we work with our clients in developing countries, middle-income countries, through investment project financing. That's the bulk of our work. That's kind of the bread and butter of what we do. That is lending money to countries so that they can build better roads, build a dam, build schools, build digital government systems, things like that, general development investments. And we also work with development policy financing, and that means direct budget support. So instead of lending particularly for a project, we will just lend to the Minister of Finance for budget support. And that loan comes with what used to be called conditions, or the strings attached, rather, that the government identifies policies that they're working on or that they've recently passed that show a particular focus of development. It might be increasing public financial management, might be strengthening governance, overall governance of the country through developing new institutions or new reforms. It could be specific to resilience in terms of developing a national disasters management policy. They can be quite broad, but typically there's a matrix of about 6 or 7 policy reforms that the country agrees to, and the World Bank often provides technical assistance to the country to meet those policy reforms. And then they can, as soon as it's approved and signed, draw down on those funds for direct budget support, and we don't monitor how it's spent. But we do make sure that they sign a clause that says they cannot use the money for weapons or other things that are on the no list, rather. And then what we also do that not a lot of people know about is advisory services and analytics. And this is a lot about what GFDRR does that I'll talk about in a moment. But in addition to lending countries financing at a very concessional rate, we also provide these technical assistance opportunities. So for example, if I'm right now leading a project in Dominica, you might hear me refer to, again, on it's a road resilience project. And we also, in addition to giving the country, lending the country money to engage with a big roads infrastructure contractor, we also provide technical assistance on things like nature-based solutions for slope stabilization. And so training their public works department on how to implement nature-based solutions, or how to ensure road safety measures. So it's also building capacity of countries to really ensure that their investments are sustainable. Or for example, in addition to the roads project in Dominica, it also includes a meteorological monitoring component, a seismic monitoring component, and we'll provide technical assistance to ensure that their Met services and other disaster management services can properly use those instruments, maintain the instruments, etc. What I didn't mention was along the side, it's all the areas that the bank really focuses on. So there's what we call global departments now. The name was recently changed. There's always restructurings at the bank, as with any big institution. And so some of these focus areas you'll see on the right are now smushed together. But interestingly, disaster risk and resilience is not a standalone global program, global department, like social protection, agriculture, education, et cetera is. And traditionally at the bank, it's kind of been one of the leftover groups, as some of these more prominent or well-defined thematic areas are a bit easier to implement. And so disaster risk and resilience has kind of been a leftover that's been packaged with urban and land. But as the bank is changing and evolving, and we're making crisis preparedness, disaster response much more of a focus, we are being pushed together with the infrastructure teams to come up with more of a infrastructure-based resilience global program. So also, as the Dean mentioned, we very much focus and frame all of our efforts around the Sendai framework. It was endorsed by the General Assembly, recognizing that the state or the government has the primary responsibility for disaster risk management. So we do work directly with governments of countries to ensure that they have the capacity to meet these goals. Of course, we include CSOs and other organizations where needed, but ultimately to support the capabilities of the government to undertake these responsibilities of reducing disaster-related mortality, reducing economic loss from disasters, reducing damage to critical infrastructure, increasing the number of national and local disasters management strategies, increasing access to hazard risk information, and increasing international cooperation and financing. And what is a recent addition, I'm trying to remember. So the Hyogo framework, as my slide says, was the framework before the Sendai framework. And the Sendai framework kind of added this financing aspect as in terms of the global evolution of disaster risk management. For a long time, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the bank focused on disaster response. So helping the countries build back better, more resilient infrastructure, then ensuring that there's, as we move into late 90s, 2000s, more preparedness work, more focus on systems. And then within the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a big focus on ensuring that there's financing available. And I'll go into this more broadly, but it's generally, if we think about disaster risk management as ensuring that countries, ensuring that natural hazards don't cause a disaster, disaster risk financing is ensuring that disasters don't cause economic shock. So a lot of how the World Bank is able to, channel funding into disaster risk management and resilience is through the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, or GFDRR. GFDRR is a global partnership financed by the development partners you see here. Don't quote me on this. Some come and go as the years change, but generally these have been the main development partners that have contributed to like an umbrella trust fund, a multi-donor trust fund. I think recently it's been about $40 million annually that countries can access broadly for technical assistance. And so how it kind of fits within the World Bank model is that the World Bank, the big machine itself, collects money from through international aid from its development partners all around the world that contribute, including the United States, who's a major contributor, in order to lend. And so the bank makes profits from the loan proceeds, et cetera, and also from donors through international aid. GFDRR is a way for countries to access technical assistance financing. and expert advice. And so in addition to the aid that let's say, for example, United States gives to the broader World Bank machine as part of its member dues, the United States also gives money through USAID and State Department to GFDRR. And it's a way for GFDRR it's a way for the World Bank to kind of consolidate funding from all of these aid agencies that want to focus on disaster reduction and recovery. And because the World Bank is a trusted partner and implementer in technical assistance, this is a way for the United States and these other donors to get better bang for their buck in supporting some of their client countries, or supporting some of the countries that are important for their aid goals. And within GFDRR, there are two different bodies. One is the technical assistance financial body that focuses on collecting the funds from the member countries and distributing them. And so they can distribute money directly to client governments or directly to World Bank teams that are working in those areas. For example, if there's a World Bank staff in Thailand who would like to support the government of Thailand to improve resilience, they can request a grant from GFDRR. Similarly, the government can also request a grant separately from the World Bank. So there's the kind of the funding channeling aspect. Then there's also the expert advice in knowledge bank information type side of the World Bank that is kind of a clearinghouse for all the nuances of disasters management, so that when a World Bank team working with the client government has a question on, what's best practices on safer schools? What are best practices on nature-based solutions? Do you have reports? Do you have experts who can reach out to? Do you have this and that? That's where World Bank staff and governments can come to for that knowledge and expert advice. And the different thematic areas within the GFDRR are listed on the right. And as I mentioned, I lead the disaster risk financing thematic area as well as the emergency preparedness and response area. And then we have cross-cutting areas on how to manage the nexus between fragility, conflict, and violence and disasters, and increasing inclusivity and gender equality within disasters management resilience. And this is just to show, as I mentioned before, we work all over the world. And so there's obviously a big headquarters in Washington, D.C., where I work. But we also have country offices in almost every low-income country or middle-income country, middle-high-income country, spread out across the world. The only countries where we often don't have offices are specifically fragile conflict, violence-affected states, or maybe small island states. For example, in the Caribbean, we have one office in Jamaica that covers all the Caribbean. And I also want to clarify that we are not a humanitarian agency. And this cartoon kind of pokes fun at that. We are the panel of experts that, in a sense, could or would come in after a disaster. Hopefully also there before a disaster to ensure that the country is working on reducing their vulnerability, increasing resilience. But we are not the humanitarian aid organizations like WFP or IOM or MSF that come in right after the event. We will come in after an event to support the post-disaster needs assessment and start coming up with quantifying the damage, really ensuring that everything is damage per sector is disaggregated. So we know, as a bank, if the government comes to us and says we need $100 million for a disaster recovery loan, we know that those numbers are substantiated with the actual needs of the country. It's a document that the World Bank often works on in collaboration with UN agencies, with other international organizations who have people on the ground to make sure that we are really hitting all the sectors and really quantifying both physical damages and economic loss. So now I'm going to go more into the meat of the talk. And first, I'm going to start with increasing resilience from a fiscal perspective, before I go into the physical perspective. I'll pause here in case there's any questions. Okay. So as I mentioned, if disaster risk management is about reducing the likelihood that a natural hazard turns into a disaster, disaster risk financing is about ensuring that a disaster is not an economic shock. Because disasters have these adverse impacts on public finances, there's deterioration in balance of payments, escalating costs of debt. Oftentimes after an event, a country might take on more loans, maybe costly loans because they have to be, quickly underwritten, etc. And there's just the debt servicing responsibilities become greater and greater, which can impact the overall macroeconomic health of the country. There's also declines in GDP if there's damages to productive infrastructure. There's often inflation and really reduction in long-term economic growth. A lot of studies have pointed to the idea that, when developing countries especially are hit by disasters, for every 2 steps, don't quote me on this, it's not quite a quantification, but for every 2 steps they've taken in building resilience over the last decade, they take 4 steps backwards if they experience a disaster, because they don't really have maybe the fiscal space or the reserves accumulated to be able to respond to disasters quickly. So they divert money away from ongoing development initiatives. For example, maybe they have a big initiative to build safer schools or, improve their education system, but then they're hit by a disaster. So all that money is funneled into disaster response, and those, for example, education gains are not realized. And as I mentioned, financial protection is one of the major pillars of disaster risk management, as defined by the Sendai framework, fitting within risk identification, risk reduction, preparedness, and reconstruction. And disaster risk financing protects lives and development. Financial costs of disasters are increasing. And of course, we can say that in light of climate change, disasters are becoming more frequent and more severe. So countries are facing more and more costs annually, but also countries are expanding. Urbanization is happening at an unprecedented rate in many countries. And so more and more cities are growing, and often in an unplanned way, often in a vulnerable way, where unplanned settlements are allowing for more people to live in the city, but often not with increased resilience. There's more vulnerability in these unplanned settlements, et cetera, leading to potential additional financial costs or contingent liabilities of the government. Because if, for example, more and more low-income people come into a city that are impacted by a disaster, they will come to the government as the insurer of last resort if they don't have a way to repair their housing or they need to access food support, et cetera. The government also has to look at how disasters impact, their own finances, but also how they impact farmers and herders, the agricultural producers, homeowners and business owners. Are there insurance policies? Is there an insurance market? Is there any market? Do they have any policies available for homeowners and business owners? Sometimes we take that for granted in the United States, complaining about the cost of house insurance or business insurance, especially in areas that are prone to disasters. But there are many countries that do not have, active non-life insurance markets that can provide, I would say, affordable policies to homeowners, or policies that are practical to homeowners and business owners. And then, of course, the poorest. How can the government respond or come up with a strategy to address vulnerable people in their countries? And that often comes through a need for shock responsive social protection. So if there's an ongoing social protection scheme in a country, how can we make that scheme shock responsive and able to scale up quickly and to pre-targeted people that are on the cusp of vulnerability that would need that extra livelihood support after an event. So countries, governments need ways to help each of these sectors respond. And disaster risk financing also considers the time dimension of managing risk. Now, after an event, there's an immediate need for financing, and there's many studies that show the longer that affected populations go without receiving funds, or the government has to respond to a disaster without additional funds, then the damages and the economic costs will increase. So having funds available immediately after an event is critical. And disaster risk financing really focuses on making sure that countries have in place reserve funds, access to contingent lines of credit, access to sovereign insurance, so that they can get those funds immediately. And then we don't focus as much on how they access financing for reconstruction. While that's very important, we want to make sure that the immediate funds are available when they need them, and then help them transition into the recovery and reconstruction phases. Also, these strategies have to be country specific. And many countries have fiscal rules in place that either the IMF or the World Bank has suggested they put in place, or their own austerity measures, for example, in reducing spending. So how can we make sure that countries can respect those fiscal rules but still access post-disaster financing? How can developing countries afford to have a reserve fund when they can, when they're often in survival mode themselves? How can countries increase private sector participation, for example, ensuring that there's an active and effective insurance market in place for homeowners and businesses as well as governments? And most importantly, how do we protect the most vulnerable? And so we help countries to develop disaster risk financing strategies as a way to really answer all these questions. And the first step of that is quantifying fiscal risks, really looking at the contingent liabilities of the government, what the government could potentially have to pay, for example, if they were hit with a 100-year event. We'll make a curve, an exceedance probability curve, and look at the likelihood of the government, what they would have to pay for a 250-year event, for a 100-year event, 50-year event, and then what are the average annual losses that governments experience from disasters, whether that be impacts on infrastructure, impacts on tourism, impacts on housing, etc. Because you're not going to purchase insurance for your home unless you know the value of your home. The same way the government should not really purchase insurance or have a savings plan in place unless they know the value of their assets or their contingent liabilities. Once we have the fiscal risks quantified, we look at options to reduce fiscal vulnerability. Beyond just the instruments, we also look at, do they have public financial management rules in place for emergency procurement? Do they have a loss and damage database set up so that they can accurately track losses and damages over time to ensure that they're planning correctly for future losses? So softer policies like that to ensure that the instruments can be used effectively. And then, of course, building capacity. And this comes back to training government officials on what disaster risk financing is, training social protection ministries on how to build shock responsive social protection systems, asset management, physical asset management that I'll go into in a moment. But these are really the building blocks of how we develop a disaster risk financing strategy. Going a little deeper into the specifics of them, how we estimate fiscal risk. I talked a little bit about it before, where we quantified these contingent liabilities. But if we look at Jamaica, for example, sorry, the slide's a little small, or the words are a little small, but we will look at the historical damage and losses. And Jamaica has a really great public information system that tracks losses and damages from all disasters. So we look at the actual losses. And then we look at modeled losses from estimating assets around the country, quantifying those assets and overlaying them with wind patterns and vulnerability curves, et cetera, to come up with modeled losses for what the country will likely experience for a 100-year event, 50-year event, et cetera. And then we come up with a geographically disaggregated look at the government's contingent liabilities. And so we can say, you know, in the center of Jamaica, it's really where asset concentration is and where the government might have the biggest bang for their buck if they focus on some kind of retrofitting for homeowners or improvement and strengthening of their assets. So it gives governments an overview of where their average annual losses are most concentrated and where they can get the biggest impact for investing in those areas. And in terms of identifying instruments, we come up with a risk layering approach. And so there's not really one instrument that's a silver bullet. We look at a combination. And so we also want to make it cost effective. And this is key. There's a lot of, you know, more developed countries are not as heavily impacted by disasters economically because they have, you know, reserves they can pull on. They've got budgets that are flexible, and they have ministries with their own reserve funds to respond to disasters. But there's a lot of countries operating with very tight margins. And so every disaster response strategy has to be super cost effective. And so starting at the bottom, for high frequency events, you know, maybe annual flooding, et cetera, countries typically respond with basic budgetary reallocation, and that's a given. Take what you know, cancel what you can in that year's budget and move it to disaster response. And then we recommend a national disaster fund, which is typically held within the Ministry of Finance. Sometimes the World Bank or the IMF might request that it be held externally, maybe by a regional bank of some sort, to ensure that there's appropriate governance and accountability, transparency. But basically, we support the development of these funds or the improvement of these funds by helping countries decide what size they should be. Typically, we advise they be roughly the size of the government's average annual losses to an event or to their most prominent events, whether it be rainfall or wind events or earthquakes. And so much over that amount, there might be some opportunity costs in terms of investment. So if the government has too big of reserves, they might be missing out on investment opportunities to reduce that risk. We also ensure that there's correct policies in place to access the funds and trace the funds, how they're used. And then on top of that, we have another risk retention instrument. So risk retention, the purple instruments are when the government retains that risk and is responsible for that risk. We have contingent lines of credit. And so if the government experiences an event, it's a loan that's in place that they can quickly draw down from without having to do all the paperwork. And they have a predefined rate and repayment terms, et cetera. Many international financial institutions are starting to offer this. The World Bank was the first with the catastrophe deferred drawdown option, or a Cat DDO, which is one of those development policy loans I explained before that essentially gives the government a nice pot of money that if they experience an event, declare a disaster, they can draw down on it within 24 hours. I think globally in the World Bank, there's about 60 examples of these. So not every country has them, but they're growing. They're becoming a bit more attainable. And then, of course, there's other post-disaster indebtedness where countries take on loans outside of a financial institution or from a financial institution that's not the World Bank. And then we have risk transfer instruments, which is essentially insurance. And we have parametric insurance that I'll explain in a moment. And then we have traditional indemnity insurance that countries can purchase for their public assets. and catastrophe insurance for private property and agriculture that the government can help subsidize to ensure that, or that's one option that the government can subsidize to ensure that there's adequate penetration to essentially reduce their contingent liabilities. So parametric insurance, if you haven't heard of it, is essentially insurance that pays out after a defined event. So it reduces the need for a loss adjuster to come out to your country to assess the losses. And essentially policies are put in place in advance that says, if a hurricane with X wind speed comes within Y distance of my capital city or this asset concentration, then we receive a payout. Or if rainfall reaches X amount over Y duration, then they receive a payout. Or if ground movement reaches this point, you get the idea. So they assign parameters to a particular event. The event happens, the country receives the payout. The best example of this is the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. It's the first risk pool that offers parametric insurance. I say the best example because it's the most cost effective. In the Caribbean, if Jamaica, for example, were to go to the private sector for a risk transfer instrument, which they did a catastrophe bond a few years ago, the rate on line, or the amount their premium is versus the payout, is much, much higher. And so they are paying super high premium costs for one individual transaction. But if you pool the risk of all the Caribbean countries together, go to the market with one transaction, then countries have a 10% rate on line, a very low premium cost for what the potential payout could be. There's also examples of this risk pooling in Africa. I used to work for the African Risk Capacity based in Johannesburg that designed what started with a drought parametric response, a parametric drought insurance program for the continent of Africa. There's also a Pacific Islands risk pool and a Southeast Asia risk pool. But really, disaster risk financing is more than just instruments. As I mentioned before, it's about improving your public financial management to ensure that you have the policies and institutions and frameworks in place to make sure the money from those instruments is spent fairly and quickly and transparently. And then also improving your data coordination management, ensuring that you have a full and accurate inventory of your public assets, so you know what's at risk, and streamlining damage and loss data collection, so you know really what your country is experiencing year in and year out from disaster impacts. So how some of these strategies look in real life, or in real examples in countries taking action to implement their disaster risk financing strategies. One is risk-based asset management systems, which I'll talk about in a moment. Another is increased government collaboration with the insurance sector that I already talked about, ensuring that the government and the private sector can both benefit from this kind of collaboration, either subsidizing and increasing in penetration, so insurance sector has more business and more appetite to take on risks, perhaps from vulnerable populations or other more innovative types of insurance. Loss and damage databases, as I mentioned, improving registries for vulnerable populations and sectors to ensure that there is a database available to improve and support the adaptive and scalable social protection systems. And then, of course, development of reserve funds and investment funds for disaster response, as I talked about before. So going specifically into disaster, or rather risk-based asset management systems, and I'm going to try and do this quickly to ensure that we have adequate time for Q&A. We just, maybe to back up a moment, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'll talk about fiscal and physical risk reduction components. And we at the bank, for a long time, or as disaster risk financing was becoming more sexy, more instruments, more excitement over the risk pooling, there was perhaps an over-focus on just putting the instruments in place, making sure governments have finances to respond to disasters. But that's not very responsible. if we think about the need for countries to really continue to reduce their risk, it doesn't make sense to continue to respond to disasters if the country is also not actively working to reduce their risk. And so we've tweaked our approach a bit, where we want to ensure that any instrument we put in place also incentivizes risk reduction. And so that might come in terms of insurance. If we're supporting a country to develop a housing insurance program, we ensure that the building codes of that country are up to date and enforced to ensure that, we're not developing an insurance policy for homes that are vulnerable. And so this incentivizes risk reduction. And one of the ways we help countries to do this in a systematic way is looking at the risk-based asset management, looking at their inventory of public assets and developing risk-based asset management systems. When we talk about assets in this sense, we're talking about built infrastructure, for example, infrastructure that the government is responsible for. It can include, equipment, vehicle fleets, etc. And there definitely needs to be asset management systems in place to address that. But when we talk about asset management for disaster resilience, we're often referring to homes, utilities, roads, ports, etc. Big assets. And so this is an example of an asset management system and how we find the ideal system for a country we work in. Many of the countries we work in are still having paper-based records. And so coming up with a system that's all automated and complex is usually not realistic in terms of sustainability or implementation or from a cost perspective. And so we typically find ourselves implementing systems that are within kind of that peach square, where they're less complex, partially manual, and they're easily updated, often by a very small team. Many of our governments are very understaffed and have many staff working on multiple departments within a ministry, have a lot of responsibilities. So coming up with a simple system is usually our most successful way of ensuring that it's sustained. And we focus on capacity building along the way to ensure that staff are trained to maintain the system. And the way we did this in practice in St. Lucia, for example, and St. Lucia was a good place to start because the population is about 115,000 in St. Lucia. The island's not that big. And so the idea of coming up with an inventory of all your public assets is not quite as daunting as coming up with an inventory of public assets, for example, in Brazil or in Turkey. And so this was a kind of a good place to start to test out some of our approaches. And since then, it's been implemented in Jordan and other countries in the Pacific, starting in Turkey. We're kind of growing broadly to ensure that when we work with disaster risk financing approaches in these countries, we're also working on asset management with them as well. And so the way we did this in St. Lucia was starting with the Association of Professional Engineers and the government's existing department within their broader structure that focuses on planning and capital projects, et cetera, to ensure that when capital projects are designed, they're not just implemented and forgot about, that they have appropriate maintenance and condition assessments and ongoing sustainability plans worked into the project. And so we started with working with that same department to work with Professional Engineers Association to undertake condition assessments of all of their public assets to ensure that they had, within their existing Excel table of public assets, they had correct values associated with or replacement values associated with the assets. And then we had design and development of the curriculum for an asset valuation course at the community college. And so it's not enough to train one season of engineers and architects and other building professionals in asset valuation and condition assessment and management. We developed a course that the community college offers every year that government officials and private sector individuals can continue to come back to. And then we developed, supported the government in developing a geolocated asset database, and supported the Ministry of Finance to integrate this into budget planning, focusing on identifying where those critical assets are that need the most attention and doing cost-effective, targeted implementation of maintenance. And finally, one other way that we support governments in increasing resilience from a physical perspective is also just basic emergency preparedness and response systems management to ensure that, when a disaster strikes, they not only have the financing to respond quickly, but also the systems in place to respond quickly and effectively. So enhancing the capacity of governments to prepare for and respond to emergencies, deploying resources, et cetera, with a focus on disasters from natural hazards, but also being able to respond to health emergencies, mass casualty events, et cetera. And making sure that all of this is grounded in clear legal frameworks as well. And we approach this, we developed this conceptual framework after a lot of countries were coming to us and saying, hey, we just experienced this event, we know we need to do something, but we don't know how to start. And so instead of just sending a team in there to do an ad hoc assessment, we developed this framework to evaluate countries on their EPNR personnel, information systems, facilities, and equipment, and their core legal and institutional frameworks to make sure that we're looking at all aspects of EPNR as we're assessing their capabilities. This is a comprehensive view of systems that works not only with the government, but also, especially in fragile states, works with NGOs, international organizations that also sometimes fill the gaps in capacities of the government to respond to an emergency. And it assesses the strengths and weaknesses of the 5 components I just mentioned and can help identify priorities for investment plans. And we offer these in packages or tools. One is called the Lessons Learned exercise, which is essentially an after-action review of an event that brings together all of the participants in a tabletop exercise to talk about lessons learned, what they could do better, develop potential investment plans. And then we also have this ready to respond tool that we can deploy in blue sky times that assesses the strengths and gaps of the current EPNR system on 360 attributes. And so within the facilities, equipment, personnel, et cetera, each is broken down into 20 thematic areas, and within those are 5, and I forget how the math works, but it's broken down into very clear and clear attributes with actionable recommendations. Okay, this is the math. Each criteria has 4 indicators with 5 key attributes. And we collect data through in-person interviews and meeting with each participant of the EPNR system. And we come up with a final diagnostic report that assesses the gaps and strengths of each of the components and come up with this output that it shows a nice quantitative assessment, but of course what's really important is the detailed qualitative information that helps to develop an investment plan that says, hey, in the short, medium, and long term, here's what your country should really focus on to develop your EPNR system to ensure that you're minimizing loss of lives and livelihood. And they can take this investment plan back to the World Bank and say, hey, we'd like $500 million to build a training center for mountain rescue, or we'd like to buy 500 fire trucks for each of our municipal centers. But they can take this investment plan anywhere to any bank and say, can you finance this? And that's all I have. I've put the websites here. And I put the corporate procurement website because if anyone's from the private sector, we're also always looking for vendors who are interested in supporting clients and countries in emergency preparedness and response. So back to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary. And that was a comprehensive overview, also with appropriate level of detail to understand the technicalities and then also the research behind it. So very important for the series from a university college organized, right? So, but there must be questions. So who wants to go first? You can either, put them in the chat or do hands up and then ask live online. So, and Brianna, thank you for putting the link in the chat also for GFDRR. So
I can go. Hi.
yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I think it is great value to our students who are actually here, which is exciting to see, and the faculty. And I think I have a question that might be of interest to the students in Math and Human Security and Resilience program and others. What kind of tips can you share with those who are entering the field or maybe want to work with such organization as World Bank? What kind of skills and knowledge those organizations look for, or again, how can students have their foot in the door, yes, like as they are preparing to enter the workforce?
And Julia, can you still please briefly introduce yourself? I mean, we know who you are.
I apologize. So
okay.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
My name is Julia Hoban, and I'm assistant professor here at COAS, and I lead our MS in Human Security and Resilience program.
Very, very important.
Would you like me to respond directly to that, or do you want to take more
questions? I think we can do, each by each.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mary.
Sure. So that's a great question. And I still have, many meetings each month with students who would like to enter into the World Bank. And I'll be honest, it's a pretty exclusive organization in terms of once you get your foot in the door, you're good, but it's very hard to get your foot in the door. And it's a lot about luck. I don't want to dwell on that, but it's about being in the right place at the right time. But to get to the right place in the right time, there are, beyond having a master's degree, which is a very important qualification for many positions at the World Bank. Unfortunately, it's pretty exclusive in that way. Having a master's degree is kind of a first point of entry, but also continuing to monitor very basic things like LinkedIn and the aid development websites for these consultancies. I'd say majority of World Bank staff are short-term consultants, and order of magnitude like 10,000 short-term consultants versus like 8,000 staff from the World Bank all around the world. And so the easiest way to get your foot in the door is starting as a short-term consultant or STC. And those kind of opportunities are often not advertised directly through the World Bank hiring website, but through task team leads themselves. I'm going to say task team lead, TTL. TTL is the name for World Bank operational team leads who hire short-term consultants or any other staff to support them. And so building your professional network on LinkedIn, attending events, even cold calling World Bank staff, or cold emailing World Bank staff and say, hey, can you give me 10 minutes for an informational interview, is really how a lot of people get in. And continuing to monitor, those websites for short-term consultancies. In terms of the profile of people, it's quite broad. As I mentioned, we really focus on ensuring that we have agricultural professionals working in agriculture, water professionals working in water. I went to get my master's in international relations. That came out really as a generalist, and some of the best advice I was given was to come up with a specialty. And that's when I started focusing on disaster risk finance, because it made me a bigger fish in a smaller pond. And while being a generalist is fine, and there's many generalists at the World Bank, I'd say it's more, you're a smaller fish in a bigger pond, and it's more difficult to get weeded out for a generalist short-term consultancy. But when you're starting to, you pick a specialty and build your network, and you're a water expert or a climate expert, you can build your network of other people in that same specialty, including World Bank specialists. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. It's very helpful.
Anybody else, since we also have some of our students on the call, which is great, don't hesitate to ask Mary one of your questions that you may or would say must have. So don't be hesitant. This is a great opportunity.
Hey, I'll just go ahead and jump in with I don't know what to call it, a shameless plug, I guess I will. You mentioned about the expertise, and I think there was some excellent words about students defining a niche area. And I just wanted to share in regards to the expertise of data science. I was previously the master's data science coordinator before I took this position as chair over here. Just wanted to throw out that if you're ever looking for any ways of collaboration from the data science point of view, we've got some undergraduate courses we're building here. It would be great for course projects, and I still maintain active connections with folks over on the Daytona Beach campus working on thesis projects and things like that. So if there's anything ever we can be helpful with that, we'd love to help. I know there's a lot of chat in the global community right now about predicting defaults. We're all on the hope that the interest rate goes down, but if we have a 1970 redo with the interest rate having to go up, there might be some concerns with backing of loans, bonds, and things like that. So if there's ever anything that comes to mind and you're looking for help from support from us, I just wanted to throw that out there. And thank you very much for your time. This is my first opportunity to be at one of these series, and I really enjoyed the hour. Thank you very much.
Mary, if I may, I have a question. It's very broad, so forgive me for that. But use of AI, so in terms of assessment, predictive models, integration of information, or program planning, program evaluation. So is there any shareable information in your field of disaster risk reduction, broadly conceived, where the World Bank is considering or is introducing systematic use of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe to respond to both questions at the same time, that's a huge section of GFDRR that I didn't really talk about because I'm not an analytics person. But we have huge wealth of, or a huge need for analytics. We have a huge wealth of information and huge client demand for more analytics to help them make decisions, risk-based decisions. And so we are always looking to partner with universities, not just for free labor, for people who need to get research done, but for more support and more ideas on how to ensure that these systems are user-friendly and are really demand-driven. And it's not just someone writing a research paper to fulfill their need to publish, but also in a way that directly pairs them with governments who really need some support in making decisions. And so we like to pull in research practitioners and other practitioners who are doing this work in real time and connect them with clients who need the work done. And when I say the work, we're starting to use more and more AI to do things, first starting with hazard response and damage assessment. And so using Earth observation data, much of it starting to be machine learning driven to assess damage in residential areas, in environmental, in non-residential areas, in urban areas, etc., to very quickly assess the damage, which saves time and is effective in fragile states or conflict zones, etc. But then also, so disaster response is key, but also using it for preparedness. And so looking at using Earth observation data to do a rooftop assessment, and teaching AI to look at roof types and use other information to come up with an idea that says, here's a geographical area, and here's the estimated replacement value for these homes, and here is their vulnerability. And so instead of paying a firm, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars to go in and do an assessment of the entire residential, you know, housing bank, there is, you know, a cost savings. Of course, there's some margin for error, but that's to be assumed. So teaching AI to look at rooftops and using Earth observation data to help countries make more informed decisions on investment planning, in, you know, maybe retrofitting homes or other types of infrastructure. Does that answer your question?
And then mine as well. Yeah, thank you so much, Mary.
Yeah.
So that has taken us beyond the hour. So thank you so much for speaking and for also agreeing to this being recorded for use in our classes. This is great. And I also would like to take the opportunity to thank Brianna for taking care. She always does, but I don't always thank her, but I would like to also slip into that habit. You know, thank you for taking care, Brianna, of the organizationals and the technicals. And thank you so much, Mary, for taking the time. And then also for your answers to our questions. So thank you, be good. And bear in mind for the rest of October, from the United States point of view, this is National Resilience Month. So take a moment to think about it. And then September is going to be National Preparedness Month. So also very, very important. And these are not national issues and aspects anymore, as we all know, and as Mary's presentation here and talk to us has underscored. So thank you so much, and you be good. Bye-bye.